Okay, so did anybody read chapters 32 to 37 of Job? I did. Yeah, that's okay. It's a lot. And I'm kind of, I know I was kind of down on him quite a bit in the beginning. The first couple of chapters, 32, 33, and part of 34, he has a lot of good things to say. Just like his other friends, a lot of the things he says are nuggets of truth. They're in general true. Or he'll say things about God that are true. But they're not exactly the right things to be said in a situation with Job. Now in chapter 32 here, he's just the new speaker. He just suddenly is there on the scene. We don't know about him. We don't know anything about who this guy is. I pulled out some commentators and had one guy try to actually tie this to Nahor, the brother of Abram. And I could not see that connection. It was very, I think, stretched and not likely. If that were true, we would have gotten a little bit more information on that, I think, from the writer here. Homer Haley, in his commentary, really likes Elihu, and he has some good things to say about him. He wrote, in response to these who hold the view that Elihu made either an insignificant contribution or no contribution at all to the discussion, it is unreasonable to believe that 6 chapters would be devoted to a speaker who said nothing of any value. Furthermore, Elihu appeared on the scene at a time of great confusion. The friends have failed. Job had said things that were untrue, expressing false ideas, and the working of God was greatly misunderstood. Elihu had a mission to fill. My view is that he made a major contribution representing a fresher viewpoint to the questions discussed by Job and the friends, a view free from their traditional prejudices, and that his speeches should be considered in this light. I agree. I like Homer Haley a lot. I use his commentary quite a bit, and I agree with a lot he says there, but I don't agree that it's a fresh viewpoint to the questions discussed by Job and the friends. I think he says a lot of things they didn't. He has some pretty good insight based on the things he heard, but in the end, he's going to have the same viewpoint and the same discussion points as his friends did. And he's going to harp on those, not in the beginning, but definitely in the part of 34, 35, 36, and 37. So they are there for a reason. Now, chapter 32, he talks about, it opens up the first 5 verses. He's angry with his friends. And that anger actually kind of permeates throughout the most of that chapter in chapter 32. A lot of the things he says there is directed toward his friends and how they were. He talks about how he was hesitant to speak. He was careful to listen. And his way to get relief, he gets into that toward the end. And I think that chapter, and really a lot of Job, should encourage us to sharpen our communication abilities. We need to learn self-control. We need to be patient as we interact with others. We should choose our words wisely. And when we read through these things, these guys had a lot to say in some very pithy way, right? I mean, they said quite a bit in just a few verses. And so we could learn a few things, I think, from not just Elihu, but the others as well, Job and his friends there. Chapter 33 and 34 is really Elihu's ideas about God. Remember, man put chapters in there, so the thought of Elihu expands both those chapters. He continues his thoughts there. In the opening paragraph, he began to set forth his arguments. He restates a lot of the charges that Job made against God. And if you think about that, let's look. Is that found in 1 through 33? I think it's 1 through 7. I think it's verses 8 through 12. Surely you have spoken in my hearing, and I have heard the sound of your words. I am pure without transgression. I am innocent, and there is no guilt in me. Behold, he invents pretext against me. He counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks. He watches all my paths. Behold, let me tell you, you are not right in this, for God is greater than man. So he's quoting some of the things that Job had said, he's kind of misconstruing a few of those words that Job says there. But notice that he brings those things out, and when he lists the things, the charges that Job has brought against God, he says there in verse 12, "Behold, let me tell you, you are not right in this, for God is greater than man." Do you agree with Elihu in that? Should Job have made some of those statements? "I am pure without transgression." Now, that's out of context. That's speaking that Job has always brought sacrifice and sought forgiveness from the Lord. "I am innocent and there is no guilt in me." I think Job is right in that. He invents pretexts against me. I don't think Job actually said that. I couldn't find it. "He counts me as his enemy." Did Job say that? Yeah, he did several times. Several times. "He puts my feet in the stocks." He doesn't say that specifically, but that's a good paraphrase of some of the things he said. "He watches all my paths." Yeah, he's always talked about how God's gaze was upon him. So, should Job be saying that God counts him as his enemy, God's enemy? Is Job right in saying that? Was Job God's enemy? No. So he was not right. He was not right. So Elihu was right in saying you can't make these charges against God. And he says God's greater than man. In other words, he's saying, who are you to make these charges? And he's right. That is true. And I wonder if maybe Homer Haley was looking at passages like this when he's talking about a fresher point of view. And so we see that. Then Elihu also in this chapter reminded Job of God's greatness, affirmed that indeed God does speak in visions and in dreams, which is true. He also works through chastisement and through the messenger. God frequently utilizes these methods in order to bring men back to him. All true. God had spoken in many times in various ways. The Hebrew writer tells us in Hebrews chapter 1. Jesus is the fulfillment and the embodiment of God's revelation to us today. John tells us that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. And after Jesus accomplished his work on earth and he ascended into heaven, remember he promised his disciples he would send that Spirit of truth so that would bring all things back to their remembrance. And so we have all the books in the New Testament, you and I. We have the Old Testament. God has revealed his will for us today. It is his message for the rest of time, so we ought to always be studying it and meditating upon it. Now, with that, all that said, and I'm kind of jumping ahead here. I don't want to jump that far ahead. It's in chapter 35. I thought it was here. I think I jumped ahead on that. I apologize. But there's some things that Elihu says where he seems to be claiming that spirit of truth. He does make mention of that. If you read through chapter 33, he makes mention that he is privy to some of the things on God. We'll come back to that maybe here in a little bit if we got time for that thing. But first, in chapter 34, he's going to go into more ideas that he has about God. He defends the character and the honor of God. He urges wise men to choose what is right. He declares that God would not act wickedly in verses 10 through 15. He maintains that God's not partial. He also describes God as being all-wise. And then in 31 to 37, he accuses Job of adding rebellion to his sin. So look there at 34, 31 to 37. For has anyone said to God, I have borne chastisement. I will not offend any more. Teach me what I do not see. If I have done iniquity, I will not do it again. Shall he recompense on your terms because you have rejected it? For you must choose and not I. Therefore declare what you know. He's talking to Job there. Men of understanding will say to me, and a wise man who hears me, Job speaks without knowledge, and his words are without wisdom. Job ought to be tried to the limit, because he answers like wicked men. For he adds rebellion to his sin. He claps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God. Do you think Job is adding rebellion to his sin. What does rebellion mean? Work against. And is Job working against God? I mean, not that we know or we see, but why would Elihu think he's working against God? What is he wanting Job to do? He actually mentions it in these verses that we just read.
Verse 31, to repent.
Okay, yeah, he wants them to repent. It's verse 33, I think. Shall he, God, recompense on your terms because you have rejected it? For you must choose and not I. Here it is. Therefore, declare what you know. He's asking, declare what? The same thing the three friends has been trying to get Job to declare this whole time. What did you do? And you'll see Elihu, or if you read through, Elihu in 36 and 37 will also claim that Job must have committed sin. He will hearken on, God does not punish the righteous, he only punishes the wicked. And so, in both the introduction and the concluding paragraphs of this section, he, I think, is unnecessarily harsh toward Job. The opening paragraph in verses 7 and 8, what man is like Job, who drinks up derision like water, who goes in company with the workers of iniquity and walks with wicked men? Man, that's pretty rough. And then, in the concluding in verse 35 there that we just read, he says Job speaks without knowledge, and his words are without wisdom. Job ought to be tried to the limit because he answers like a wicked man, like wicked men. I mean, obviously, Job was not some great sinner that the friends in Elihu portrayed him to be, even though Elihu's statements about Job were inaccurate. What he said about God is, as we were saying earlier, generally true. He noted some great characteristics about God. He talks about God's righteousness and God's impartiality. He's omniscient, verses 21 and 30. So we see some things that they have that are right, but they could not let go of this idea that Job must have sinned. And so, chapter 35, Elihu's explanation of God's silence. He defends God's silence by arguing that Job's demand for a hearing was based on pride. And we can make no demands of God. Neither our righteousness nor our transgressions can place any kind of demands upon God. So, verses 1 through 8, Job's words are presumptuous, he says. And verses 9 through 16, God does not answer because of man's pride. So he's accusing Job of pride. And then 36 to 37, all one thought. They flow together. Elihu's final appeal to Job. Look at verse 4. Chapter 36, verse 4. Here's what Elihu is writing about himself. For truly my words are not false. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you. Well, what if I said that to you? Reed, you don't understand. One more perfect in knowledge is here with you. I mean, man, how arrogant. Why do you think he said, I mean, after everything he said, and he was very humble in the opening, in that first chapter, chapter 32, why do you think he suddenly says one more perfect is with you? Why does he do that? Now, this is kind of presumptuous maybe on our part, we're supposing here, but I've got an idea. He is young, right? And one of the things I've noticed with myself in my younger years, from younger people nowadays, when they begin to talk and want to engage in a conversation where maybe they are in a disagreement with me, it always starts off very respectful. But once they get going, they get real excited. Have you ever seen a young person get excited and they get going and they think they're doing well, and then they start talking a lot off the cuff, and what happens? They
kind of get emotional with it.
Yep. Emotions come in, and they say things without thinking. It's just blurted out there because they're feeling good, and they're just kind of going with the flow of it. And I think that's probably what's going on with Elihu, because this is just out of nowhere, and it doesn't quite fit with the attitude we saw in the beginning. But it is building up toward this. You can see that build up. As he goes along, he's getting a little bit more confident in his things, and now he's starting to say things a little bit presumptuous that he should not say. And he goes on, so in this first part of chapter 36, it's a continuation of defense of God. Then there's an appeal to Job in 16 to 23 to yield to God. You need to yield to God. In other words, he's saying that you're right. All that's happening to you is happening to you from God. Who else says all these bad things are happening to him from God? Who else says that? Do his friends say that? Yeah. Does Job say that? He does. He does say that. So they're all thinking the same thing. The only difference is, I think that Job probably has the same thoughts on theology, that God does not punish the righteous. But now he's getting all this, he would define as punishment from God, but he doesn't see any sin. So it's making him stop and think. And I think that's why it's happening. This is not only for Job's sake, but for his friends and everyone else that Job has influence with, that when all this is over, he can take this out there to them that no, God does not work this way. Because they learned from this. And they're going to learn from the Lord here in chapters 38 and following, because they're there to hear these things as well. The last 2/3 of this speech of chapters 36 and 37 prepares Job, and is also going to prepare the reader, us, for the revelation of God in the whirlwind. So going into 37, it continues that description of God's power, and he's already been talking about, he talks about been talking about the storm and lightning and thunder. The grandeur of the speech is going up with Elihu. It's a really good speech he's got going, explaining God, and he's using the metaphor of thunder and lightning, the majesty of God's captured here. And the thunder, accompanied by flashes of lightning. Have you ever, Josh and Jonah, Jody, remember when we've been outside, we're looking at the lightning and enjoying that, and all of a sudden a big thunder hits, and it's so loud, you can feel it in your chest? Yeah, you have. All right, Reed, have you? And, the other day, the kids were in the house. I was walking over. Just as I was walking over in the patio, this thunder hit at me. It was so loud, it shook things out of me. My first reaction was duck and get inside. And it scared me. And so here, when Elihu brings this up, verses 1 through, let's read verses 1 through 5 of 37. At this also my heart trembles and leaps from its place. Listen closely to the thunder of his voice, and the rumbling that goes out from his mouth. Under the whole heaven he lets loose, and his lightning to the ends of the earth. After it a voice roars, he thunders with his majestic voice, and he does not restrain the lightnings when his voice is heard. God thunders with his voice wondrously, doing great things which we cannot comprehend. And he goes on to in that same idea. I thought that was the section I wanted it to be. It's not. It must be later on, where he talks about how it puts fear in us, or something of that nature, somewhere in this passage. But he goes on with that same storm mentality. He talks about the storm, the snow. He talks about the rain. And back in the day, when I was talking to Dick earlier, he was born in 1929. And I asked him, in 1939, when he was 10 years old, what was it like? Did you guys have food? Well, he said, well, yeah, we were on a farm. So they had plenty of food. And if you were out there in the farm, Dick, and it started raining and thundering and lightning, would you stay out there in the field? You would? Man, I wouldn't. Okay, what if it was hailing and a lot of lightning? Would you stay out there in the field? No, you'd go back inside. And I think most farmers, at least I would think, in Job's day, when the big storm would come in, you had to put things off and come back inside. If we have a big thunderstorm on a work day, we'd have to put it off. Or if you were going to plan a picnic and it started to rain, you'd put it off. And when those sort of things happens to you and me, we may look at it and just think, oh, man, we wish it wasn't raining. We were going to do things outside. But like when me and the kids are outside, we're looking at the sky, we're watching the storms from far off, and we're listening to that thunder. And I start to think about the wondrous creation of God, that he can do these amazing things. And I think Elihu is hinting that, we go out there and we see these things, and we see the might and we see the power of God. And he equates that to the voice of God. And his point to Job is simply, why aren't you listening to God? And when you think about it, that's a great point you want to make to somebody who may be in the throngs of sin, and you want them to come back. But the problem is, even though it's a great lesson that Elihu gives us here, it's not a lesson for Job. That's the problem. But he's building this same idea. And it started in chapter 36, and going into 37, hitting on this idea of this great storm. And he pushes this to him in the last verse, not the last verse, but in verse 13, he writes this: whether for correction or for his world or for loving kindness, he causeth it to happen. He's talking about the storm. So the storm can be sent for correction. People today often disassociate God from weather, but he sometimes uses those things to get our attention. Do you believe that God will still work providentially in that way, that maybe he might send a big hurricane and bring great destruction upon a city to try and get our attention? Could that happen today? You think God would work like that? We do that ourselves? We create hurricanes? Well, I'm talking about hurricane. Do you think God would use a hurricane, create one, and send it to destroy a city, for example, Louisiana, or maybe some other cities, to get our attention? Well, he wouldn't flood the entire earth again, no. But could he, or do you think he would? My question is, would he? Do you think God would providentially bring destruction upon a country or a people to get their attention? No. No? You're not sure? No, you don't think so?
I would lean no.
You would lean no? Why not? Why? Have we seen God work that way before in Scripture? Would he bring, usually it would be in the form of a drought, wouldn't it? He would. He would take away the rains. Even though he is impartial. But he's also impartial with the drought. He'll bring the rain upon the just and the unjust, but if he wants to get that nation's attention, take the rain away from everybody. Why does he do that? He wants them to start to think. One of the biggest things he did was when he sent the Israelites into captivity, and they went all the way to Babylon. They were in captivity. Of course, their prophets were telling them, it's not going to last long, don't worry. And then God destroyed the city of Jerusalem. And they got hurt. They got wind of that. And they said, oh, don't worry, the temple's still standing. And then it was a year later, they destroyed the temple. And every time they would pray, even though they couldn't sacrifice, the Jews would always pray toward the temple. But now the temple is destroyed. What do they have left? Nothing. And that's the point that God gave to Ezekiel about the vision of the valley of the dry bones. That's where he wanted to get them, to a point where they had no hope. You ever go back and read, I think it's Ezekiel 37, the valley of the dry bone vision, is that the bones are very dry, and his people say, we are without hope. And that's where God wanted them. He wanted to get them to a point where they had nothing left to rely on but him. So when you think about it from that perspective, will God work in people's lives to bring them to a point where they have nothing left to hope in but him? Will God work in people's lives to do that? He will. Still today, providentially. If you think he's willing to do that in our lives, and we know that from Hebrews and other passages in the New Testament, do you think he could also work in the macro at looking at countries or governments? And when they get to taking things too far, he takes them out. Nations rise and nations fall. Who's the one that puts those leaders in charge? God does. He raised up the Assyrians to take care of the northern kingdom of Israel. He raised them up to do that. And remember Habakkuk, when he was pleading to God, what are you going to do about Israel and all their sin? You should do so. You should punish them. And God said, well, I am. I'm raising up the Assyrians. And what was Habakkuk's reaction to that? Do you remember? Did you read that? Oh, not the Assyrians, because he knew them. They were evil. They were mean. He didn't want them to come and destroy Israel because that would be too much. And God said, well, I am going to use them, and they will go too far. And when they do, I will punish them for it. And I think God still works in these ways today. Now, we can't point and say, ha, New Orleans, you got what you deserve. God sent that. We can't say that. But for me, whenever big destruction happens to any country, I take pause. I would take pause and think, why'd that happen? Maybe we need to step back for a moment and reconsider where we are going. Why did God confuse the language of all those people building the Tower of Babel? Remember that the text said they were going to build that tower to make a name for themselves. And God saw that, and what did he see? Pride. What was the point of building the Tower of Babel? What do you think that point was? Oh, Jonah, what was the point of building the Tower of Babel? To keep them all together so they wouldn't scatter across the earth like God wanted them to. But why did they want it to reach the heavens? I think that's partly right. And that's definitely where it would lead to. We see it happening a lot. It started with the Babylonians. We see a lot of these towered structures being built toward the heavens. And you would go up there whenever you wanted to, you were a king or you were some ruler or a priest, you would walk up the steps of that huge tower, and the people would think that you are clasping hands with God. And when God clasped your hand, then he's telling you, yeah, go ahead and do what you're doing. And then the priest or the king would come down and says, yes, I saw God, he held my hand. And so they would, in their minds, would think, we have, like you were saying, Connor, we have this connection with God now. And that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to reach where God was, I think. And God said, nope, not going to happen. And so he confused their language and forced them to go out. We're way off topic here a little bit. Sorry about that. But I think God can and does use the weather for correction. I see it happening throughout the Old Testament, and I think that he could still do that today providentially. Now, I can't sit here and point this, or this, but I have seen destruction coming upon cities or nations, and it wakes people up, gets them to think a little bit. When do people generally go to religious establishments and seek prayer in mass? When bad things happen that are big to their nations. We generally see that uptick. So you get a bit of fear there. It may be sent for his world, the moisture, the essential survival of plants, life, and animals, and of course, loving kindness. God cares for his creation, and that's why he sends us the rain. And we see that, Elihu bringing that to light in verse 13. And he wants Job to consider the wonders of God, verse 14. So he brings up all these things, just like we would look at creation of the wonders of God. Think of the wonders of God. You need to be thinking more about God. And he brings all this, and the very last thing he says in verse 24, therefore men fear him. And notice he says, therefore men. He doesn't say Job or man. Who do you think he's talking to? Therefore men fear him. He's talking to Job and his three friends, because he's angry with them too. He does not regard any who are wise of heart. Is that true? Does God consider any who are wise of heart, wise in their own estimation? He does not. But who does see themselves as being wise of heart? Elihu. Remember? He's the perfect one, standing there with Job. So he's not thinking very well about the things he says. And of course, chapter 38 opens up with that whirlwind. It's the Hebrew word for whirlwind, a great wind that follows, or not follows, but comes before the storm. And that's what that Hebrew word is. And so here's this storm coming. So I almost wonder if while Elihu is talking, you see the storm coming, and he sees that he's using that as his reference. That's what I see. And then as it's coming, he's saying, all right, this will be great, Job. You better look for repentance. Here's the storm. And then God's voice comes booming out of the storm. It is not what he expects. Any other thoughts or comments you want to make on what we looked at on this passage, or anything I said, if you want to dive deeper into that? Yeah, and I do. The more I read, every time I read through that, and you can see that buildup. He's using that storm analogy a lot. I bet you there was a storm coming, and he was looking at it and pointing at it and using that illustration, and then the voice of God comes. And man, what a! I wish I could have been there to witness that. I've been pretty amazing.